Ever found yourself doing the polite head nod when hit with a question you don't have a clear answer for? With the European elections on the horizon, catching up with the multitude of implications for businesses and organizations can be quite challenging, and perhaps not that exciting. So how about we simplify things for you? In this podcast, we will extend our focus beyond electoral ballots to provide the guidance that you need to effectively prepare your business and anticipate what's coming ahead. And also, who said that politics has to be a dreary affair? I'm your host, a communication expert, not a public affairs consultant, not a European politics guru, but I'm the one chatting with them. And let me assure you, this podcast won't have you nodding off. This is Beyond the Ballot, a podcast powered by Publyon. What's on the agenda of today's episode? Firstly, we will look at the context in which the European elections take place. Why is 2024 a year of change? And what are the hot topics that are going to absorb the political activity ahead of June? Secondly, what's going on the international scene? And thirdly, why is this relevant for businesses? What is worth bearing in mind? And how can we best prepare for this major transition? And now, enough of me talking, let's dive straight into the episode. Good morning, Radboud.
Hey.
Welcome to this very first podcast from Publyon.
Yay, cool.
I hope you're excited as I am.
I am. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. First of all, can I call you Rad?
Absolutely. It's the name basically everybody uses for me. Please go for it.
Thanks for that. Okay, so before we delve into the heart of the conversation, would you like to share something about your background, who you are, why you're here? Good questions.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Rad. I've been working in public affairs for I think about 15 years now, and I'm working at Publyon, primarily focusing on sustainability files. So that's really what I focus my work on, but I also have a broader interest, obviously, in geopolitics, trade policy, and rugby. Let's not forget about that topic.
Oh yeah, thanks for that. So what I would like to talk about with you today is this big political event that's happening in 2024, the European elections. Of course, here in the Brussels bubble, we hear about it at least once a day. But outside of the bubble, we can imagine that people might be wondering what's important to know about it. So rather than getting lost in all these political talks, why don't we break it down to the essentials, start from the beginning, and, tell us why are these elections particularly relevant this year?
I mean, the European elections are interesting this year as well because we will probably see a shift in the political composition of the European Parliament, where we see, political parties that are on the right side of the spectrum probably gaining more influence and importance, which would also probably lead to a change in policies, where over the last couple of years we've seen really a lot of policies coming out of the Green Deal, really with a big focus on sustainability. We can probably expect this to not necessarily be rolled back, but that there will be a shift more towards competitiveness. So how can we ensure that the EU as a whole remains competitive in the world?
Well, at the beginning, actually, you mentioned this shift in the European Parliament's composition towards the right side.
Yeah.
And I guess we can get this because of the outcome that's, of the national elections.
Yeah.
We know that we've had elections in last November in the Netherlands, where, to the surprise of a lot of people, we saw that Party for Freedom, the right-wing Party for Freedom, taking over.
Yeah.
But of course, we have also national governments that are leaning towards the right side in Italy, in Hungary. So this is really going to sort of change the majority from like the traditional center-liberal family to more, right-wing kind of political group.
Yeah, that's very possible. I mean, we obviously still need to see what the election outcome is. But at least from the conversations that we're having with people in the European Parliament, but also the European Commission, is that we can expect this shift to happen. And I mean, that's also the interesting part of politics, right? when we go left, we can always expect a reaction to come that we go right.
Feels like it's a chess game, you know. You never know what the last move will do to the overall.
That's true. It's true. It's true. I mean, and then there's obviously big topics, I think, when it comes to elections. You already mentioned some of the national elections where I think migration was a big challenge. On the one hand, we have the topic in terms of refugees, but on the other hand, we also have a skills shortage. So how are we going to solve that? And we see countries like Italy is actually saying, okay, we need 500,000 people to come in to help us with this skills shortage to ensure that our economies keep running. So I think that's a big topic as well. Another big topic, like I was saying in the introduction, is the competitiveness of the EU. Energy prices have dropped, but they're still high compared to the United States and the bigger economies around us. So that's a challenge for companies operating in the EU. How are we going to tackle that? We have all the Green Deal policies that are coming out of that. Think about all the due diligence requirements that companies need to deal with. We have to implement them in the coming years. How are we going to do that? How are we going to finance that component as well of due diligence?
And for example, in this regard, with let's say green policies, we know that in the previous term, von der Leyen has put a lot of efforts in pushing the Green Deal forward. But at the same time, we also see that within her party, there's some clashes because her party would like to almost call for a moratorium on green policies. Because of course there's going to be a time of implementation of all these policies in national governments. So does that mean that climate change concerns would play a second fiddle in the next, topics?
I mean, we're still, the goal is still to become net zero. But what the challenge now is, and from a personal perspective, but also what I hear from stakeholders in Brussels, is the focus should be in implementing them. There, so many policies have come forward. It's going to be a big challenge for everybody, companies, corporations, but also the member states to implement it, to enforce it all. And I think that's why they're talking about this regulatory pause. Okay, we have all these new policies in place now. How are we going to do this? This operationalization of the legislation, both for Brussels and on the member state level, I think is still a big question for a lot of policies. And that's why a regulatory pause seems interesting and understandable from that perspective. But it doesn't mean that the EU is saying, hey, we're not going to focus on Green Deal policies anymore, because then we can come back to these energy challenges that are still in place in the EU. How are we going to tackle that? We still need to import it. We used to get them from Russia. We're getting them now from the United States. We're getting them from other countries in the Middle East. But now we have a conflict in the Red Sea. The energy that's transported by ships to the EU cannot arrive in the EU, which again leads to a very volatile market.
Now, let's stop for a second. We understand that there's major challenges for member states and organizations to enforce all this legislation that's coming out of this current term. Unfortunately, the war in Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East, are undermining the operations of companies in Europe. And they're also posing a threat to the competitiveness of the European economy. So, strategic autonomy is at the core. But why? What other global developments can reshape the geopolitical game? Stay tuned and let's find out.
I would say that one of the biggest focuses will be basically on the strategic autonomy of Europe in this case. And this is also interesting if you also zoom out a little bit and you look at the global context this year, because a lot of political events are happening also in UK. We have elections in UK in the second half of the year. And we also have elections in the US. And there's probably going to be a rematch between Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
True.
So, how do you see that?
I think there's a lot of thinking going on in terms of what could happen if Donald Trump is reelected. One big challenge will be security. I think there will be a challenge for the EU to to deal with the security questions that they are faced with, be it Ukraine, again, be it the shipping lanes that are being protected now by the US Navy and the UK. How can we ensure that the EU can project also its hard power in some way or form? Because we can expect that a US administration headed by Donald Trump will think, okay, well, this is an EU problem. You solve it yourself. It's not the role of the United States anymore to take care of this. So that's one thing. And also, the situation in Ukraine. I mean, Donald Trump says he can finish the conflict in 24 hours. So, I mean, it's not that easy and not that simple. But what are the implications for the EU for that? In terms of trade, I mean, we know that he's very interested in imposing all kinds of trade restrictions or sanctions. So what does that mean for inter-EU, US trade as well? So a lot of uncertainty, but I hope that EU countries and the Commission are well aware of this now. And I think they are, that there is really a need to prepare for this.
Absolutely.
And now the focus is on you. Now that you're able to understand the backdrop against which the European elections take place, what should you keep an eye on? And how can you make sure that the next European Parliament is receptive of your needs and those of your organization? Let's check it out.
In these few months ahead of the elections, if I asked you to give 3 key pieces of advice to organizations and businesses, what would they be?
Well, engage, number one. I mean, if you want to ensure that the new parliament is informed about the needs of your organization and how they can become successful. So what are some enabling policies and laws that need to be in place for you to be successful in your business operations? Or if you're a nonprofit, same story, to be able to do your service delivery in the best possible way. So engaging with the European Commission now would be one of the essential pieces of advice, which in practical terms really means putting a priority list on a piece of paper, reaching out to them and start talking to them. The same counts for the European Parliament. Try to figure out who's going to remain in the European Parliament, which people are influential in the European Parliament that are going to stay, that you can talk to ensure that your messages come across. When the European Commission, as well as the European Parliament, are going to decide on their priorities for the next years. A second point of advice would really be, hey, all these due diligence policies that have been coming out of the Green Deal, you really need to prepare for those. For example, the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directives, which basically means that you as a company need to report on your sustainability commitments within your supply chain as a company. How are you going to do that? You got these mechanisms in place in your operations. Yeah, and then thirdly, I would also really keep an eye on geopolitical developments. It's not just Russia and Ukraine. We have shipping lanes in the Middle East that are blocked now. But we also have the China-Taiwan conflict, which seems to be warming up. What will this do to your supply chain? Will you be able to get your hands on the raw materials or semi-finished products that you need to be able to continue your production or your service delivery, whatever that it is that you're doing? And you might want to think about the risk that entails. So I think that's the third very important thing to prepare for the coming year.
It's quite interesting because, of course, I can imagine that if I've started a startup and I need to catch up with all these things, and at some point I might wonder, okay, but where do I start? How do I do it? It's quite easy to get lost in all these legislations.
Sure.
So, what would you say to, for example, Sven, that has a tech startup, to advise?
I mean, it obviously depends on what you're doing as a startup. Maybe you're coming up with a novel product that doesn't exist. Sometimes this happens. There's no regulation and no rules for a new product. I mean, the first time they started to provide payment apps on your phone, they developed it, but there was no law in place to make it legal. So it depends on what you're making. If you're making a novel product that's never been in the market before, obviously you need to inform policymakers about it to make it legal, to make it be part of the regulatory bodies, to be able to bring it to the market. That's one. And if you're starting to operate in a market that already exists, here I think we can come back to what I was saying in terms of advice to engage.
Yeah.
Why would you engage? Because, for example, if you're working on packaging and you have a new product on the market that can be just as competitive as single-use plastics, for example, you need to have a certain regulatory policies in place to help your business model to grow, for example, while you could also at the same time showcase through studies or whatever else you have for data that your product will actually help with reducing waste or improve the environmental conditions in which we're living. So data is important, gather data, but engaging with the Commission, the Parliament is key here as well, to align what you're trying to achieve as a company or as an organization with the policies that come out here in Brussels.
Yeah. And they can also rely on us as well, companies like us, to
absolutely
facilitate the process.
Happy to help, of course.
Okay, I think this is perfect conclusion of today's
All right.
episode. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime.
Thanks. See you next time.
All righty. Bye.
Bye.
This podcast falls within Publion's Beyond the Ballot campaign, which encompasses a series of activities that aimed at providing you with the essential knowledge and guidance to effectively prepare your business for what's coming ahead. Follow our LinkedIn page for more details, and do not hesitate to contact us at eu@publyon.com.